We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The French left agrees rare coalition deal to take on Macron. France's Socialist Party and hard left La France Insoumise agreed in principle yesterday to run together in the June parliamentary elections and try to deprive newly re-elected President Emmanuel Macron of a majority. What's the long-term effect of this for France going forward? For insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His forthcoming book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, if confirmed, the coalition pact, which the Greens and Communists approved earlier this week, will be the first time the French left has united in 20 years, but under the helm of the Eurosceptic leftist LFI this time around. The deal took shape under the leadership of LFI's firebrand Jean-Luc Mélenchon, fared much better than the ailing Socialist Party. So how big of a challenge will this be for Macron, and what does it mean for Marine Le Pen?
It's very significant. This is something that should cause all to perk up their ears. What I mean is there is a distinct possibility that as a result of the parliamentary elections in a few weeks in France, that this new coalition led by Mélenchon and his party, France Unbowed, could claim a parliamentary majority, which would mean that Mélenchon would be prime minister under Mr. Macron, although you can well imagine that there will be sharp clashes between the two, and that is built into the system, which could lead to what the French call cohabitation. Recall that this possibility of a left victory is not beyond the realm of imagination. If you go back to the first round of the presidential election a few weeks ago, if you add up all the totals of Mélenchon's party, the Communists, the Greens, the Socialists, they would have finished first ahead of Macron in terms of the first round. Now, what it means for Madame Le Pen, it's unclear, because it's also unclear how her party will do in this parliamentary election. I have to say that I was rather stunned to read that the so-called overseas territories of France, speaking of the colonies such as Martinique and Guadeloupe, that they voted in favor of Madame Le Pen. Now, I interpreted that, as did others, as a kind of way to slap Mr. Macron in the face, but still, when you have this predominantly black population of the Caribbean, within hailing distance, in fact, not only of our friends in Haiti and Jamaica and Cuba, but also of the mainland of North America, this is something that we should not lose sight of. Also, we should not lose sight of the fact that this could be significant because I'm afraid to say the other shoe is in the process of dropping. What I mean by that is, look at the Wall Street Journal this morning. There is a foretaste of what Secretary of State Blinken was about to deliver before he came down with COVID, announcing a tightened policy towards the People's Republic of China. And what's striking about the article is that Russia and China are spoken of as one theater. And I would particularly urge our friends on the left to read this article because basically it suggests what some of us have been saying all along, that the Ukraine crisis is part of a larger Cold War, perhaps leading to hot war battle, not only involving Moscow, but Beijing. And then opposite the editorial page is another striking piece by former Texas Senator, U.S. Senator Phil Gramm and Roger Wicker, the senator from Mississippi, who, if the Republicans take the Senate, will be heading the Armed Services Committee of the U.S. Senate. They basically say that Taiwan should be converted into a U.S. unsinkable aircraft carrier. To use the phrase of the headline, they want to make Taiwan into a porcupine. By that meaning that Beijing would be pricked, if not worse, if it seeks to claim the territory that it considers to be its own. So this suggests that we're entering a very uncertain field, a very uncertain kind of terrain. And therefore, this news about the French left could not have come a moment too soon, because I dare say that whatever recent comments that have been made by Mélenchon and the Socialist Communist agrees, that this could possibly help to restrain President Macron in terms of deepening the relationship with NATO, which various parties in that coalition have expressed skepticism about, not to mention Mr. Macron himself calling NATO brain dead. But also it could lead to skepticism towards the French and therefore NATO role in the crisis and conflict in Ukraine. And then finally, speaking as a historian, I would hope that the possibility that you could have radicals elected to lead France, speaking of the Mélenchon-led coalition, he being a former Trotskyite, by the way, should cause many on this side of the Atlantic to rethink the unnecessary, the inflated with yeast notion they have of the founding of the United States in 1776, which, of course, is followed by a few years by the French Revolution of 1789. I think France's revolution, which, of course, led to the abolition of slavery, and the Haitian Revolution by 1791, 1804, can be justifiably pointed to with pride by many in France, whereas what happened in North America led to a deepening of slavery, more genocide against Native Americans, and now, as the title of the book you so kindly mentioned in my introduction, could lead us to the precipice of a peculiar kind of U.S. fascism.
Slovakia has warned on Wednesday that it will not be able to agree with the European Commission's proposal for a ban on Russian oil, basically saying that would destroy our economy. It seems to me that gas and oil, oil embargoes not being withheld, that the leaders of Europe are hell-bent on destroying their economies one way or another. But your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that they're playing a kind of three-card Monte. Those of you who are familiar with that New York Times Square game, you really have to follow their sleight of hand. I mean, for example, there are sanctions on Russia, we are told, but not sanctions on the Gazprom Bank, the number 3 bank in Russia, the bank that facilitates natural gas trading. And if President Trump's hold would be the leading bank. And then the New York Times tells us that India is buying Russian petroleum on the cheap, refining it, and then selling it back to the Western Europeans who knowingly buy it. And so they're still consuming energy from Russia after a detour through India. So it's very difficult to take seriously what some of these European leaders are saying. They're obviously involving themselves in a kind of sleight of hand, but it's still rather dangerous because they're whipping up hysteria. They're whipping up hysteria with regard to this conflict, and many are predicting that sooner rather than later, Washington and his NATO allies will have to become even more involved in this crisis in Ukraine in order to rescue the Zelensky regime. And that could include boots on the ground. It could include more muscular intervention. And dare I mention the biolabs that purportedly were found on Ukrainian territory controlled by Washington. Dare I mention the N-word, the nuclear option, for example. So this crisis is very profound, very serious, which brings us back to point number one, which is that this possible victory of the left in France is not arriving, if it does arrive, a moment too soon.
I'm glad you mentioned the escalation of the U.S. and NATO, because as all of these weapons have been pouring into the country, I've been asking the question, well, who's going to use them? Because current reports indicate that Russia is accomplishing what it has set out to accomplish, probably slower than anticipated, but accomplishing nonetheless. So I'm just sitting back looking at all of this armament going into the country saying, well, who's going to be around to use it?
Well, that is one concern. Another is that we all know that Ukraine is a sink of corruption. We all know about the scandals involving Hunter Biden, the president's son, and perhaps the big man himself, as he was obliquely referred to, speaking of the U.S. president. Do not be surprised that a la Afghanistan in the 1980s, when weapons were poured into that country and then leaked out and were used ultimately against the United States and its allies, in terms of jeopardizing the European economy itself and the short-sightedness of their leaders, particularly Ursula von der Leyen, the de facto prime minister of the European Union, they are apparently not thinking this through in terms of how these weapons could be sold on the black market, probably being sold on the black market as we speak, and then could be turned westward against the European Union and its allies. It's a very dangerous state of affairs, and I hope the Europeans wake up before it's too late.
Your thoughts on the Virgin Islands? I find that interesting. They're protesting UK's direct rule plan after their premier's arrest in the U.S.
Well, these are remaining colonies. What's interesting about North America and the United States is that it is not only is surrounded by colonies of Great Britain, but we oftentimes forget that northeast of Maine are a few French islands that are part of these so-called overseas territories. And I've oftentimes wondered of what France intends for these islands, particularly if there's a downturn in relations with Washington. And I also wonder how those islands voted. I've seen voting totals with regard to the French election concerning Guadeloupe and Martinique and New Caledonia, for example, in the South Pacific, but not with regard to these aforementioned islands.
And finally, France shifting blame on Russia in Mali as Paris losing influence and control in Africa. A mass grave discovered by Malian soldiers near a vacated French base prompted Paris to accuse a private Russian paramilitary organization, Wagner Group, of planting corpses there to smear the French armed forces. Your thoughts on this development, Dr. Horne?
Well, I've been following the story about the corpses. The bodies apparently had been decomposing for some time, which would put it in a time frame when France was control of the territory in which they were found. It's apparent that France is losing influence in that part of Africa. And to come back to where we began, the Texas book that you so kindly mentioned in your introduction also has evidence as to why there's so much anger at France, because during the French intervention in Mexico in the 1860s, they basically recruited soldiers from that part of Africa and sent them across the Atlantic to prop up their misrule in Mexico. And indeed, some of the soldiers, the African soldiers, may have relatives and descendants not only still in Mexico, but some of them might have crossed the border into Texas, where I'm now sitting.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Folks, you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Lee, and I'm joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon. There's more on the other side. Stay tuned.